Hello students, I am Sunil Ranjan and I am an English teacher. In this session now, I have come with the poem Thoughts in a Garden by Andrew Marvell. And the poem begins, how vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak or bays, and their incessant labours see crowned from some single herb or tree. Well, these are the beginning lines, and I move on to the explanation of the entire poem. Thoughts in a Garden by Andrew Marvell is a unique poem which is romantic in its expression, metaphysical in its word game, and classical in its music. It is romantic because it is about the nature in subject and theme, and it is the expression of the poet's personal and emotional feelings about life in the nature and society. The poem's style is metaphysical because it uses the conceit, forceful argument, allusions from sources like the Bible, myths, and metaphysical philosophies. It is a classical poem in its form because the stanzas, rhythm, rhyme and word choice is similar to the ones in classical poetry, carefully perfected form and a language different from the ordinary. The theme is garden, that is the symbol of life and nature, which is the perfect place for physical, mental and spiritual comfort and satisfaction, unlike the society where pleasure is false and temporary. The poet has finally found the nature and realized its value. He claims that the nature is the only true place for complete luxury. Thoughts in a Garden is a unique metaphysical poem which is romantic in its subject matter and also contains classical elements in its diction, meter and structure. The poem is written in heroic couplet which deals with the poet's experience of feelings and ideas about the garden that represents the nature. The poet begins by comparing the nature with society and social life and criticizing the society and busy world life. In the first stanza, the speaker criticizes men who vainly amaze themselves by putting a garland of a few leaves and believing they have achieved victory, prestige and reward for all their endless labors. But in fact, the true and complete pleasure lies in the complete garland of repose in the nature. In the second stanza, he personifies the quietness and innocence in the nature and speaks to them, saying that he has finally found them after losing his time in men's company. Then he calls the trees amorous, that is sexually playful or powerful. Expressing such an odd emotion and attachment with trees, he criticizes lovers for cutting trees to write their beloveds' names. In the fourth stanza, he claims that when men's heart of love and youth is finished, they turn to the nature. According to the speaker, even the gods did this when, for example, Apollo and Pan changed their lovers into trees. In the second part of the poem, that is stanzas 3 to 7, the speaker develops his arguments and opinions about the nature. In the fifth stanza, he gives a very sensuous, that is rich description of his physical pleasure. In the sixth stanza, he argues that his pleasure is moreover mental. Here he uses an odd metaphysical philosophical idea that the mind contains another world and garden as a well inside it. In the seventh stanza, he further claims that his pleasure has a spiritual aspect. He romanticizes how he feels. He feels as if his soul is singing and gliding from tree to tree as a bird, combing its feathers and preparing for the eternal flight of salvation. Here is also an indirect allusion of the Holy Spirit of the Bible. The third and last part of the poem is the conclusion, that is, stanzas 8 and 9. Before making the concluding remark that there can be no question of genuine pleasure without the nature, the speaker compares himself with the lonely Adam in Eden. He also argues that being lonely was the second paradise, that is, heavenly state for Adam before Eve brought about the fall. In the ninth stanza, the speaker thanks God for creating a unique world of its own, that is, the garden. The garden of the nature in general has its own time. The rush and hurry of the society is not here. Even the sun seems to have its own sweet course. The garden is therefore the only source of true physical, mental, and spiritual satisfaction and repose. As a metaphysical poem, Thoughts in a Garden uses conceit, wit, far-fetched images and allusions, and a dramatic situation. The balance of emotion and intellect is also another metaphysical feature. The romantic myths about gods, Apollo and Pan is changing girls and enjoying the nature. The biblical illusion of Adam's lonely happiness are heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. Within the context of the argument, the trees and peace of the garden are personified and even sexualized. The argument about physical pleasure is twisted into the argument about mental pleasure. At this point, the poet brings a truly metaphysical idea about the mind. He argues, according to a medieval philosophy, that his mind is an ocean of all the things and images of the real world. He further extends the idea of pleasurable experience by arguing that his pleasure is actually spiritual. There he goes on to create the imagery of his soul flying like a dove and preparing for the eternal flight of salvation. The same idea of spiritual pleasure is also related to the comparison with Adam in Eden. The last stanza also contains another metaphysical element, the idea of the garden as a separate sundial. The poem is also a dramatic and emotional expression of personal feelings, which is at the same time balanced with witty and intellectual ideas and allusions. This unified sensibility also gives the poem another feature of metaphysical poetry. As a classical poem, it exhibits the qualities like the use of a different poetic diction, heroic couplet, careful rhythm and design, classical allusions, and so on. The poem's main line of argument is not difficult to summarize, but there are so many difficult words, and even ordinary words have been used in unusual sense. Many sentences have a Latin-like word order with the verb at the end. There is the classical perfection in its meter and design and structure as a whole. The main theme of the poem is that peaceful life in the nature is more satisfying than social life and human company. The poem is striking in its sensuous imagery, witty ideas, and a balance between romantic and classical elements, as well as its metaphysical qualities. Thoughts in a Garden is basically a poem about someone who thinks that hanging out in nature is the best thing a person could do. But the poem doesn't start out that way. In fact, the poem opens far, far away from Marvell's garden world with a condemnation of society. It criticizes men who work to gain public recognition because really they are losing out. All that time in the office means they aren't spending time in the great outdoors. And according to Marvell, They've got their priorities all mixed up. Next, the speaker talks about how he used to look for quiet and innocence in society, but has discovered that even the best that mankind has to offer isn't as awesome as the solitude of nature. And just in case anyone remains unconvinced, the speaker calls in some Greek mythology for backup. Even classical gods like Apollo and Pan, he says, liked plants better than people. Stanza 5 marks a shift in the speaker's argument from nature versus society into pure praise for the awesomeness of nature, epitomized by the idea of the garden. There's lots of delicious fruit, so many melons that you can't even find room to walk, and nice cushy grass to fall on in case you get too drunk on all the wine that luscious clusters of grapes are dripping into your mouth. Marvell then starts talking about spiritual things like the mind and the soul. It's complicated language, but the speaker is basically saying that being in the garden allows the mind to be at its best and the soul to be at its most content. And what would be extremely awesome for the mind and soul would be the opportunity to enjoy the garden alone. In biblical terms, Adam would have been better off if Eve never existed. The poem concludes with some images of God as a gardener clockmaker and compares the flowers in the garden to a super huge sundial by which mankind can measure their lives. So this is the end of the explanation of the poem Thoughts in a Garden. And my dear students, if you have subscribed to my channel, well, fine. If you haven't, I suggest you to subscribe to my channel so that you get to know a lot more about literature in the upcoming videos. Thank you.